Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm good. Every time they say you can't see him, but I love that. It's like, well, okay, no problem. I'm here today with Tre'vell Anderson. We're talking about his new book. We see each other: a Black trans journey through TV and film. Tell us about your book.
Yeah, so the book is a part kind of history of trans images on screen since the beginning of moving images, and part memoir, part, my story of how the images, the movies, the TV shows that I saw influenced me to become, the fabulous person that is here before you today. And so it is, it's an easy read. I write like I talk. I like to tell people that. So it's very digestible, I hope. And the goal ultimately is to try to further this conversation around trans representation and trans visibility that we've been having, in our local communities and in Hollywood for a little minute now.
How have trans lives historically have been portrayed in film and television?
Well, not great, I'll tell you that. So much of what we've seen on screen as it relates to trans people, it's painted us as serial killers, it's painted us as thieves and deceptors, it's painted us in terms of our traumas, but it hasn't talked about our love, it hasn't talked about our care, and it hasn't shown really that, we are just like everyone else. We put our pants on one leg at a time like everybody else. And so I think we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years in particular that begin to change a little bit, but we're still not where we need to be in terms of images on screen that fully represent the complexities of our lives as trans people.
What do you think is holding that back?
Oh, now that's a big question there, James. I think that we as trans people, we exhibit and represent freedom. And I think when people see us making the decisions for ourselves that we do, it unsettles all of the lack of freedom within them. And so there's an attempt to control and contain and legislate it. But if folks were to just lean into their own freedom, their own desires, their own making of themselves, I think that would allow us to get, to that promised land we say we want to be of inclusion and equality and support.
Tre'vell, behind that, you can actually drop the mic. That was good. That was perfect. I just heard the mic drop there. I just heard it drop. So how and why the personal perspective of the story as a Black trans journalist is such an important part of this story?
Well, I think oftentimes we think of, movies and TV shows and the arts, a landscape as like frivolous, as if it has no meaning. But the reality is so many of us have learned about parts of ourselves by watching stuff on TV, about watching movies, right? And it's allowed us to access so many possibilities of how we can exist and move through the world. But for trans folks, and for Black trans folks more specifically, we don't always have that connection. And so it was important for me to tell my own personal story in hopes that, the rest of you all can think more deeply, right, about how what you're seeing on screen, how that's leading to the very real, violences that trans people, Black trans people in particular, are experiencing every single day.
That's really interesting because you could look at you're any minority group is experiencing the same thing. Any minority
Absolutely.
group. It's just crazy the way things are going. So, how the history of Black trans people in film has manifested in your life?
Well, I often say that, as we go through, we've kind of referenced the legislative attack that trans people, trans women and girls specifically are facing in this particular moment. And I often think about the thing that keeps me going, that keeps me fighting back, that keeps me showing up to work as a journalist to cover these stories. And that's the fact that I know I belong to a long line of Black trans brilliance and excellence, of folks who existed before today when we didn't have the language, right, that we have today to describe ourselves. ourselves, but they were moving through the worlds and moving through community in spite of that, without the language, and still existing. And so knowing that I belong to that long legacy of folks, I find motivating and encouraging. And so that's how it has showed up in my life. It has given me the courage to keep going in spite of all of the foolishness that we are navigating as a community.
You got that right. A lot of foolishness. And you're right. It sounds like it's fuel for your fire that it keeps driving you. That's what it sounds
Absolutely. And it absolutely does. And I think, because when you grow up and you think that you're like the only one of you in a particular space, it can be isolating. It can be very lonely. But when you lock into and learn that history, and you learn that actually I'm not the only one, that I actually belong to a broader community of ancestors, of transcestors, right, whose energies and whose existences, they can be the wind at your back in a lot of ways. Because if they did it, we can definitely do it.
How can the media increase transgender representation? I can't talk, both in front of and behind the camera. And speaking of which, you behind the camera, any aspirations?
I am one of those people who has entirely too many aspirations, and I want to do it all, so stay tuned. But I think that the core of that answer is about providing the opportunity and the resources to trans folks who are interested in telling their stories, and then getting out the way. Oftentimes, folks want to provide the resource and bring people in, but then they want to dictate what the story is, right? And so you end up having Black people, trans people as just the face of something, but they haven't really, grappled with it. They haven't really wrestled with it. Their impact isn't really felt. And so it's about passing those resources on to folks, and then stepping out the way and allowing them to tell the story as it most, naturally comes to them. That's how we will begin to see shifts and changes in the types of works that we're seeing on screen.
It sounds like early Black cinema. That's what it sounds like.
And it actually absolutely is. The parallels, right, between early Black cinema, even current, Black cinema, Black Hollywood, Black representation, right? Let's be real. The similarities with that, and then the trans community, same thing with just broader LGBTQ representation. We can, any historically marginalized or excluded community, right? It's the same story, and at some point we've got to stop, right, that story, and hopefully we're getting to a point where we can do that.
I've been speaking with Tre'vell Anderson, an award-winning journalist, social curator, world changer. We're gonna say that. Also writes and reports for Essence, Teen Vogue, The Washington Post, Esquire, and Time Magazine. Tre'vell, thank you so much for joining us on Morning Blend and having the courage to be you.
Thank you so much for having me.